Before the music at the Grand Ole Opry, there was only the sound of shovels hitting dirt. Before the glittering suits, there were only rags and hunger. Jack Anglin did not walk onto the stage. He climbed. He clawed his way out of the grave of poverty with bloody hands and an iron will. And the one who held his safety rope throughout that vertical journey was Louise, his wife, his companion, and his silent witness in the darkness. They fought the world to get there. But today's story is not about victory. It is about the terrible price they paid to reach the top. This story begins in a world that was black and white, defined by the red clay of the South and the gray despair of an economic collapse. Jack Anglin was born on May 13, 1916, on a farm in Franklin, Tennessee. He was the youngest of 7 children. In 1916, being the youngest in a farming family wasn't a privilege. It was a survival challenge. The Anglins were not wealthy. They were people of the soil, living in a time when the gap between getting by and starving was measured in rainfall and harvest yields. From the moment he took his first breath, Jack was surrounded by the sounds of struggle, but he was also surrounded by music. In the rural South of the early 20th century, music was not a pastime. It was a utility. It was the only medicine they could afford. Jack's father, a man with calloused hands and a soul weary from labor, played the fiddle. It was a rough, scratching sound, the sound of old barn dances and Sunday mornings. He taught Jack to play the guitar when the boy was barely big enough to wrap his small hands around the neck. Jack was different from the start. While other boys in Williamson County were learning to plow, Jack was learning to listen. He couldn't read a note of music. Musical literacy was a luxury for the city folk. But he possessed an internal metronome that was terrifyingly precise. He didn't just hear the melody, he felt the pulse. By the time he was 14, the Depression had fully gripped the nation. The year was 1930. The world had turned gray. Men were wandering the roads looking for work that didn't exist. In the Anglin house, the guitar wasn't a toy anymore. It was a potential lifeline. Jack, along with his brothers Van and Jim, formed the Anglin Brothers. They were children of the radio age, captivated by the voices drifting in from the static. The Carter family, Jimmy Rogers. They began to play on local radio stations in Nashville and Birmingham, but we must be careful not to romanticize this. This wasn't glamour. This was grueling, unglamorous work. They played for pennies. They played for exposure in a world where exposure didn't pay the rent. They were singing for their supper, quite literally. It was during this period of nomadic struggle in the mid-1930s that the threads of fate began to tighten. The Anglin brothers were trying to make a name for themselves, but they were just one of 1,000 family bands trying to scream over the noise of poverty. They needed an ally. They needed a partner. Destiny arrived in the form of another struggling family, the Wrights. Johnny Wright was 2 years older than Jack, born in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Like Jack, he was a child of the Depression, a carpenter and a cabinet maker by trade who played music because his soul demanded it. Johnny was the voice, a high, piercing tenor that could cut through the thickest crowd noise. Jack was the rhythm, a driving, relentless force on the guitar. When they met, it wasn't just two musicians finding a jam partner. It was two halves of a mechanism clicking into place. But the union between the Anglins and the Wrights was about to become far more than just professional. It was about to become a dynasty. And this is where Louise enters the frame. Louise Wright was Johnny's sister. She was a woman of the times, quiet, fiercely loyal, and possessed of a spine made of steel. She had grown up in the same hard-scrabble world as Jack. She knew the value of $1. And she knew the cost of a dream. When Jack Anglin met Louise Wright, it wasn't a whirlwind courtship of flowers and chocolates. They couldn't afford flowers. It was a recognition of shared resilience. They were two survivors, looking at each other across the wasteland of the Depression, realizing that they were stronger together than they were apart. At the same time, Johnny Wright was looking at Jack's sister-in-law. The connections were dizzying, a tight knot of blood and marriage. In 1937, Jack Anglin married Louise Wright. Shortly after, Johnny Wright married Muriel Deason. Stop and consider the weight of this moment. Two couples, four people, bound by marriage, by blood, and by music. They were barely in their 20s. They had no money. The country was on the brink of a world war. They squeezed into shared houses, shared cars, and shared dreams. They became a tribe. For Louise, marrying Jack Anglin meant signing a contract with instability. Jack was a man possessed by the rhythm. He was restless. The early years of their marriage were not defined by domestic bliss, but by the relentless motion of the road. Louise wasn't just a wife, she was a logistics manager, a nurse, a confidant, and the keeper of the meager finances. In 1939, Jack and Johnny officially formed the duo Johnny and Jack. They called their backing band the Tennessee Mountain Boys. It sounds heroic now, printed in history books, but the reality was a grind that would break lesser men. They traveled in broken-down sedans, strapping the upright bass to the roof because there was no room inside. They drove through the night on unpaved roads, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate hope that the next radio station would let them play for 15 minutes at dawn. They played in schoolhouses, on the backs of flatbed trucks in dusty honky-tonks where the chicken wire protected the band from flying beer bottles. Louise was there. She was the witness to the struggle. She saw Jack when the adrenaline of the show wore off. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes when the car broke down for the third time in a week. She saw the humiliation of having to count pennies to buy a loaf of bread. But she also saw the magic. There was something happening between Johnny and Jack. A sound was being born. Jack's guitar playing was evolving. He wasn't just strumming chords, he was attacking the instrument. He began to incorporate a strange syncopated beat, a chunka-chunka rhythm that was heavier, more percussive than the light, airy sound of traditional hillbilly music. It was a rhythm that hinted at something new, something that didn't have a name yet. It was the heartbeat of the future. However, just as they began to find their footing, the world caught fire. World War II erupted. The draft notices began to arrive. The momentum they had fought so hard to build was halted. Jack Anglin, like millions of other young men, faced the uncertainty of a world at war. He served his time, his hands temporarily trading the guitar neck for the tools of conflict. For Louise, the war years were a different kind of hell. It was the waiting, the silence of the house, the fear of the telegram. She was a young wife in a world of absent men, holding the family together while the world tore itself apart. This period forged a bond between Louise and her sister-in-law Muriel. They were the women left behind, the keepers of the flame. They raised the children, tended the victory gardens, and prayed for the rhythm to return home. When the war ended in 1945, Jack returned, but he wasn't the same. None of them were. The innocence of the pre-war years was gone. There was a new urgency in the air. Jack was now nearing 30. In the music business, even then, 30 was old to be up and coming. He felt the pressure of time. He looked at Louise, who had stood by him through the poverty and the war, and he made a silent vow. He was going to make it. He was going to buy her a house where the roof didn't leak. He was going to put her in a car that didn't break down. He and Johnny reunited with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. They looked at the musical landscape of post-war America. It was changing. The old hillbilly sound was being polished. People wanted songs about love, about heartbreak, but they wanted them to dance to. Jack Anglin took his guitar and tightened his grip. "We have to be louder," he told Johnny. "We have to be tighter." They began to tour again, but this time, the desperation was replaced by a cold, professional determination. They weren't just the Tennessee Mountain Boys anymore. They were a unit. They brought Muriel, now going by the stage name Kitty Wells, on the road with them. She was the girl singer, a novelty act in the male-dominated show, paid a fraction of the money. Louise Anglin watched this dynamic closely. She watched her husband and her brother build their machine. She watched her sister-in-law stand in the background, holding a guitar she barely played, singing harmony. Louise knew the talent that was hidden there. She knew that this family was sitting on a powder keg of potential. But for now, the spotlight was on the men. The late 1940s were a blur of highway markers and neon signs. They moved from station to station, WNOX in Knoxville, WPTF in Raleigh, KWKH in Shreveport. They were climbing the ladder, rung by painful rung. It was during these years in the late 40s that Jack Anglin truly defined his role. He became the aggressive half of the duo. Johnny was the smiling front man, the smooth talker. Jack was the intensity. On stage, he didn't smile as much. He focused on the rhythm. He drove the band. He was the one who argued with the promoters when the money was short. He was the protector. And Louise was the sanctuary. When Jack came off the road, vibrating with the stress of the business, it was Louise who grounded him. She was the soft place to land. Their marriage became the bedrock of his sanity. In an industry known for infidelity, for whiskey-soaked nights and broken vows, Jack and Louise were an anomaly. They were steady. But stability doesn't make headlines, and it doesn't sell records. They needed a hit. They had been working for a decade, scratching at the door of the big time, but the door remained locked. They were respected, yes. They were working, yes, but they weren't stars. Jack Anglin could feel the frustration mounting. He was a man of immense pride. He looked at the charts and saw men with half his talent driving Cadillacs. He looked at Louise, still living a modest life, and he felt he was failing her. The hunger of his childhood had morphed into the ambition of his adulthood. He didn't know it yet, but the breakthrough was coming. It would come not from a traditional mountain ballad, but from a strange hybrid sound that Jack had been nurturing in his head, a sound that borrowed the pulse of the Caribbean and grafted it onto the heart of Tennessee. But before the gold records, before the Grand Ole Opry, the Anglin Wright clan would have to endure one final test of their resolve. They would have to navigate the treacherous waters of the recording industry, a shark tank where country boys were often chewed up and spit out. Jack Anglin was ready to fight. He had his guitar. He had his brother. And in the dark, quiet hours of the night, he had Louise whispering to him that he was good enough, that the time was coming. The soil had been tilled, the seeds had been planted in dirt and blood. Now, as the 1950s dawned, it was time for the harvest. The 1950s did not arrive in Nashville with a whisper. They arrived with the roar of a V8 engine and the crackle of a tube amplifier. For Jack Anglin and the Wright family, the decade began not on a calendar, but in a recording studio, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of hot wax. The years of grinding poverty, of playing for pennies in schoolhouses and sleeping in cars, had hardened them into a unit of terrifying professional efficiency. They were no longer boys hoping for a break. They were men demanding a place at the table. And Jack Anglin had a secret weapon. It wasn't a lyric and it wasn't a melody. It was a rhythm. To understand the sonic revolution that Jack Anglin was about to unleash, one must look at the landscape of country music in 1950. It was largely defined by the boom chick rhythm of the Carter family, or the swinging fiddle of Bob Wills. It was predictable. It was safe. But Jack Anglin, the boy who had learned to listen before he learned to read, heard something different in his head. He heard a pulse that didn't belong in the hills of Tennessee. He heard the syncopated, driving snap of the Caribbean. It sounds absurd in retrospect, a poor white boy from Franklin, Tennessee, grafting a Latin beat onto hillbilly music. But Jack didn't care about genre purity. He cared about what made people move. He began to mute the strings of his acoustic guitar with the palm of his hand, striking them with a percussive force that sounded less like a guitar and more like a snare drum. Chunka, 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 chunka. It was aggressive. It was driving. It was the Latin beat, or as some called it, the rumba boogie. When Johnny and Jack stepped into the studio to record Poison Love in 1950, they weren't just recording a song, they were laying down a challenge. The song, written by Elmer Laird, was a catchy tale of romantic woe, but under Jack's hands it became a hypnotic engine. That driving rhythm cut through the static of AM radio like a knife. Poison Love was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Released in 1951, it didn't just climb the charts, it camped there. It reached number 4 on the Billboard country charts. For the first time in his life, Jack Anglin held a piece of vinyl that wasn't just a record of his voice, but a validator of his existence. The money began to flow, not a torrent yet, but a steady stream that washed away the immediate fear of hunger. Louise Anglin watched this transformation with a quiet, steady gaze. She saw the change in her husband's posture. The slump of the depression was gone, replaced by the upright confidence of a man who had proven his worth. But she also saw the new beast that had entered their marriage, the demand. Success in the 1950s music industry was a relentless master. A hit record wasn't a destination. It was a starting gun for a marathon that never ended. To keep the record selling, you had to be everywhere. You had to be a voice on the radio in Shreveport at dawn and a body on a stage in Tulsa at dusk. Jack and Johnny hit the road with a ferocity that made their earlier years look like a vacation. But now the stakes were higher. They weren't driving broken-down sedans. They were driving Cadillacs, the ultimate symbol of the hillbilly dream realized. Yet the Cadillac was a deceptive comfort. It was a steel cage that trapped them on the asphalt for 300 days a year. While Jack was out conquering the airwaves with his rumba boogie, a secondary narrative was unfolding within the clan, one that would arguably become more historically significant than Johnny and Jack themselves. And it was Jack Anglin, the rhythm man, who would play the crucial, often overlooked role of the architect. The subject was Kitty Wells. By 1952, Kitty, Johnny's wife and Jack's sister-in-law, was ready to quit. She was a mother. She was tired of the road. She had recorded gospel sides and sung backup, but she had never broken through as a solo star. In the 1950s, the conventional wisdom of Nashville was absolute and sexist. Women could not sell country records as headliners. They were window dressing. They were the girl singer, meant to give the boys a break during the set. Kitty was resigned to her fate. She was prepared to hang up her guitar and focus on raising her children, retreating into the domestic sphere that Louise occupied. But Jack Anglin refused to accept this. There is a specific moment in history that hinges on Jack's stubbornness. A song had been pitched to them, a rebuttal to Hank Thompson's massive hit, The Wild Side of Life. Thompson's song lamented a woman who had gone wrong. The rebuttal song, titled It Wasn't God Who Made Honky-Tonk Angels, flipped the script, blaming unfaithful men for creating wild women. It was controversial. It was daring. And the record label, Decca, wasn't sure about it. Kitty was hesitant. She didn't want to stir up trouble. She just wanted the $125 session fee. It was Jack Anglin who pushed. Jack, with his ear for the commercial jugular, understood that controversy sold. But more importantly, he understood that Kitty's voice, that piercing, mournful, utterly unpretentious instrument, was the perfect vessel for the song. He argued, he cajoled, he insisted that she record it. He wasn't just supporting his family, he was engineering a coup. Kitty recorded the song. The explosion was nuclear. It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels became the first song by a solo female artist to hit #1 on the Billboard country charts. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It shattered the glass ceiling of Nashville so completely that the shards are still falling today. Kitty Wells became the queen of country music, and standing in the wings, rhythm guitar in hand, was Jack Anglin. He didn't seek the spotlight for this victory. He didn't demand credit in the newspapers, but he knew. He knew that he had helped wind the watch that was now telling time for the entire industry. The success of Kitty Wells lifted the entire family. Johnny and Jack were no longer just a hit duo. They were the guardians of the Queen. They were a package deal. The Johnny and Jack and Kitty Wells Show became one of the highest-grossing touring acts in America. In 1952, the ultimate validation arrived. The Grand Ole Opry invited them to join. For a boy from Williamson County, the Ryman Auditorium was not a building. It was the Vatican. The stage boards were sacred. To be invited as a member was to be told that you belonged to history. When Jack Anglin stood on that stage for his induction, bathed in the hot glare of the spotlights, feeling the vibrations of the crowd, he had traveled 1,000,000 miles from the dirt floor of his childhood. He had made it. But what of Louise? While Jack stood in the light, Louise Anglin was constructing the world that made the light possible. The untold story of the 1950s is the story of the women who stayed home. Louise was not merely waiting, she was managing an enterprise. With Jack gone for weeks at a time, Louise became the de facto head of the household. She managed the finances, which were becoming increasingly complex. She dealt with the repairs, the bills, the family obligations. But more than that, Louise was the emotional anchor for a man who lived his life at 100 miles per hour. Jack Anglin was intense. The aggressive persona he adopted for the business wasn't a mask he could easily take off. He carried the stress of the charts, the stress of the payroll, and the stress of maintaining their position in a fickle industry. When he returned to Nashville, often exhausted and wired on adrenaline and caffeine, it was Louise who had to metabolize that energy. She created a sanctuary. Their home became the one place where Jack Anglin didn't have to be Jack Anglin, the star. He could just be Jack. He could put down the guitar. He could forget the rumba boogie. This role of the silent partner is often dismissed as passive, but in the context of the Anglin marriage, it was an active, vital labor. Without Louise's steady hand, the centrifugal force of fame might have spun Jack out into the darkness that claimed so many of his peers. The alcoholism, the divorces, the reckless self-destruction. Jack remained grounded because Louise was the ground. The mid-1950s were the golden afternoon of their lives. The hits kept coming. 1954 went to #1. It was a perfect pop country confection, showcasing their tight harmonies and Jack's infectious rhythm. They were selling out theaters. They were traveling overseas to play for servicemen. They were living the American dream in Technicolor. But in the music business, the sun sets quickly. By 1956, a new sound was rising from Memphis. It wasn't the Latin beat. It was something primal, sexual, and terrifying to the Nashville establishment. It was a truck driver named Elvis Presley. Rock and roll didn't just arrive, it invaded. Overnight, the country sound of fiddles and steel guitars seemed archaic. The teenagers who had bought Johnny and Jack records were now screaming for Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the new gods of rhythm. Jack Anglin, now entering his 40s, watched this tidal wave with the wary eye of a survivor. Many of his peers panicked. They tried to dress younger, sing faster, or they simply quit, bitter and broken. Jack didn't panic. He adapted. This is where the resilience of his character shines brightest. He understood that the core of the music, the emotion, the rhythm was the same. He didn't try to be Elvis, but he didn't retreat into the past either. Johnny and Jack continued to record, pushing their sound, incorporating heavier drums, looking for the bridge between the old world and the new. They were fighting a defensive war, holding the line for traditional country music while the world changed around them, and they were winning. They kept their spot on the Opry. They kept their tour dates. They proved that they were not a fad. As the decade drew to a close, Jack Anglin was a man in full. He was a success, a husband, a mentor. He had navigated the Depression, the war, and the rock and roll revolution. He had built a fortress of security for Louise. But as 1960 approached, the shadows were lengthening. The road, which had given them everything, was beginning to extract its toll. The miles were adding up. The fatigue was accumulating in the bones. And in the distance, unknown to Jack, unknown to Louise, the calendar was slowly turning toward a cold gray March in 1963. The golden era was ending. The era of tragedy was about to begin. But for now, the Cadillac was still running. The radio was still playing their song, and Jack Anglin was driving fast, his eyes on the horizon, believing, as all self-made men do, that he could outrun anything, even fate itself. The dawn of the 1960s brought a strange electric tension to Nashville. It was no longer the dusty, oversized town where Jack Anglin had first arrived with a guitar case held together by hope and twine. It was becoming Music City, USA, a corporate metropolis of glass and steel where the rough edges of the hillbilly soul were being sanded down by the polished machinery of the new era. For Jack Anglin, now a man in his mid-40s, this new world presented a complex challenge. He was a king, certainly. He walked the streets of Nashville with the heavy, assured stride of a man who had conquered the charts. The royalties from the Johnny and Jack hits, combined with the massive, empire-building success of the Kitty Wells Show, meant that the Anglin household was no longer counting pennies. Louise had the security Jack had promised her in the dark days of the Depression. There were new cars in the driveway, tailored suits in the closet, and the respect of an entire industry. But security is often a mask for stagnation, and Jack Anglin was not a man built for standing still. He watched as the Nashville sound began to take over. Producers like Chet Atkins were replacing the fiddle with the violin, the steel guitar with the piano, and the raw nasal twang of the mountains with smooth chorale backing vocals. The rough, driving Latin beat that Jack had pioneered was suddenly at risk of sounding like a relic, an artifact of a bygone era. Yet Jack did not retreat into bitterness. Instead, he leaned into his role as a mentor. This is the crucial, often forgotten chapter of his life that explains the sheer devastation of the final tragedy. Jack Anglin became a bridge between the old guard and the new firebrands, and no fire burned brighter or hotter than a young woman named Patsy Cline. The relationship between the Anglin Wright clan and Patsy Cline was not merely professional, it was familial. Patsy was a force of nature, loud, brash, unapologetic, and possessed of a voice that could crack a heart open at 50 paces. She was everything the new Nashville represented: bold, crossover ready, and undeniably brilliant. But beneath the bravado, Patsy was a woman navigating a shark tank, and she looked to the veterans for guidance. Jack Anglin adored her. He saw in Patsy the same hunger he had felt in 1930. He saw the same refusal to be defined by poverty or expectation. They toured together often, sharing the grueling intimacy of the road. The road in the early 1960s was a unique ecosystem. It was a rolling village of buses and Cadillacs, moving from town to town in a convoy of exhaust and ambition. In this village, Jack was the elder statesman, the steady hand, the rhythm man who kept the beat. Patsy was the wild daughter, the future queen. Louise Anglin watched this dynamic from her position of quiet strength. She welcomed Patsy into their circle. The Anglin home became a place of respite, a sanctuary where the stars could drop their personas and just be people. Louise understood that for Jack, mentoring artists like Patsy wasn't just charity. It was a way of staying young. It was a way of keeping his finger on the pulse of the rhythm he loved so desperately. But the rhythm of the road was becoming dangerous. The demands were escalating. To maintain their status, the artists were pushing themselves to the physical brink. They were flying in small single-engine planes to make dates in remote cities. They were driving through the night on two-lane highways, fueled by amphetamines and coffee, chasing the next paycheck, the next applause. The margin for error was shrinking with every mile. The winter of 1963 was particularly harsh. The weather seemed to reflect the mood of a nation that was losing its innocence, and it was in this atmosphere of cold rain and gray skies that the sequence of events leading to the catastrophe began. It started with a tragedy that served as a grim prelude. Cactus Jack Call, a beloved disc jockey in Kansas City, a man who had spun Johnny and Jack records, who had helped build their fame, died in a car accident in January 1963. The country music community was devastated. In this world, the DJ was the priest, the conduit between the artist and the people. When a DJ died, the family mourned. A benefit concert was organized for his widow and children, scheduled for Sunday, March 3, 1963, in Kansas City. It was to be a gathering of the tribe. The lineup was a testament to the brotherhood of the Opry: George Jones, Billy Walker, Dottie West, Wilma Lee, and Stoney Cooper. And of course the heavy hitters, Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Patsy Cline. Jack Anglin wanted to go. His heart was in Kansas City. But fate, in its cruel and arbitrary wisdom, intervened. Johnny and Jack had other obligations, business that kept them in Nashville. Or perhaps it was just the weariness of the road. Whatever the reason, Jack Anglin stayed home. He stayed in Nashville with Louise. He sat in his living room, safe and warm, while his friends boarded their vehicles and planes to fly north into the gathering gloom. The concert in Kansas City was a triumph. It was one of those magical nights where the music transcended the sorrow. Patsy Cline, battling a severe flu, walked onto the stage and delivered performances that those in attendance would describe as otherworldly. She closed the final show, standing in a white chiffon dress singing, "I'll Sail My Ship Alone." It was a haunting, prophetic image, the Queen holding court one last time. But the real drama was happening backstage, in the logistics of the return trip. The weather had turned violent. A storm system was churning across the Midwest, a wall of rain and fog that grounded commercial flights. Dottie West, a close friend of Patsy's and a contemporary of Jack's, looked at the sky and felt a cold dread. She urged Patsy to drive back with her. "Don't fly," she pleaded. "The road is safer." Patsy, tired, sick, and anxious to get home to her children, shook her head. She had a pilot. Randy Hughes, who was also her manager, and the son-in-law of Cowboy Copas, was flying a Piper Comanche. It was a small plane, nimble but fragile against the might of a storm. "Don't worry about me, Hoss," Patsy told Dottie. "When it's my time to go, it's my time." Dottie West got in her car and drove. Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins got into the Piper Comanche. Back in Nashville, Jack Anglin went about his Monday. March 4th passed. March 5th arrived. The weather in Nashville was unsettled, gusty, and damp. Jack was likely working on business, perhaps rehearsing with Johnny. He was unaware that in the skies above Tennessee, a drama of life and death was playing out. Randy Hughes was fighting the aircraft. The Piper Comanche was caught in a trap of low visibility and disorientation. The ground and the sky blended into a single sheet of gray. At approximately 6:20 p.m. on Tuesday, March 5th, the engine roared as the plane entered a graveyard spiral. It slammed into a wooded hillside near Camden, Tennessee, 90 miles west of Nashville. The impact was absolute. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack Anglin was at home when the news broke. It did not come all at once. It came in fragments, in whispers over the telephone lines that crisscrossed the city. A plane is missing. Have you heard from Randy? They didn't land at Cornelia Fort. Louise saw the color drain from her husband's face. She saw him pace the floor, a caged animal sensing the slaughter. Jack Anglin was a man who believed in action. He wanted to get in his car. He wanted to drive to the airport. He wanted to start searching. But there was nowhere to go. There was only the waiting, the terrible, suffocating waiting that Louise knew so well from the war years. Then the confirmation came. The wreckage had been found. There were no survivors. Patsy, Hawkshaw, Copas, Randy, gone. The shock that hit Nashville on the morning of March 6th is impossible to overstate. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a decapitation. The Grand Ole Opry had lost 3 of its brightest stars in a single heartbeat. For Jack Anglin, the blow was physical. It was a punch to the gut that dropped him to his knees. He had lost friends before. He had lost family. But this was different. This was Patsy. This was the girl he had mentored, the future he had believed in. And Copas and Hawkins, these were men he had shared dressing rooms with, men he had traded jokes and whiskey with for 20 years. They were his peers. They were the rhythm section of his life. Louise Anglin found herself in a position of terrifying familiarity. Once more, she had to be the steady hand in the storm. She watched her husband unravel. Jack was not merely grieving, he was frantic. Survivor's guilt is a powerful and corrosive acid. Why wasn't I there? Why them? Why did they fly? The questions tormented him. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He spent the days between the crash and the funeral in a state of hyperactivity. He visited the families. He went to the home of Charlie Dick, Patsy's husband, offering whatever help he could give. He went to the Copas house. He was trying to fix the unfixable. He was trying to use his presence, his energy, to fill the massive voids that had opened up in the lives of his friends. He was driving himself into the ground, fueled by grief and a desperate need to be useful. The city of Nashville was draped in black. The radio stations suspended their normal programming to play the songs of the fallen. Every time Jack turned on the ignition of his car, Patsy's voice filled the cabin. I fall to pieces. Crazy. Sweet dreams. It was a relentless sonic haunting. Louise urged him to rest. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. She saw the tremor in his hands. She knew, with the intuition of a wife who had watched him for 25 years, that he was walking a dangerous line. He was distracted. He was hollowed out. He was a man operating on autopilot in a world that had suddenly lost its coordinates. But Jack couldn't rest. There was one final duty to perform: the funeral. A joint memorial service was scheduled for Friday, March 8th. It was to be the final goodbye. The entire industry would be there. The fans would line the streets. It was an event of state, a moment where the community would come together to try and heal the wound. On the night of March 7th, the eve of the funeral, the atmosphere in the Anglin house was heavy. Jack was quiet. The frantic energy of the previous days had settled into a grim, steel-eyed resolve. He sat with Louise. Perhaps they talked about the old days, about the start of it all. Perhaps they sat in silence, listening to the rain that was beginning to fall again on the roof. Jack Anglin went to bed that night a man burdened by the weight of 1,000 memories. He thought of the dirt roads of Franklin. He thought of the first time he met Johnny. He thought of the Latin beat. He thought of Patsy's laugh, loud and raucous in a backstage hallway. He did not know that he was spending his final night on Earth. He woke on the morning of March 8th with a specific mundane thought in his head. He needed to look presentable. He was Jack Anglin of the Grand Ole Opry. He was a professional. He would not stand by Patsy's grave looking disheveled. He dressed quietly, not waking Louise. He drank his coffee. He picked up his keys. The air outside was damp and cold. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening more rain. Jack walked to his car. It was a powerful machine, a symbol of his success. He started the engine. The rumble of the motor was a familiar comfort, a rhythm he could control in a world where everything else had spun into chaos. He backed out of the driveway. He looked at the house one last time, the house he had bought for Louise, the sanctuary they had built together. He didn't know it was goodbye. He thought he was just going to the barber shop. He turned the wheel and drove onto the street, merging into the traffic of a city in mourning. He was driving toward the barber, toward the funeral, toward his friends. He was driving toward the curve on New Due West Avenue. The stage was set. The tragedy of the plane crash was over, but the tragedy of the funeral was just beginning. The silence of the birds was about to be broken by the screech of tires, and the story of Jack Anglin was about to collide with its brutal, inevitable end. The morning of Friday, March 8th, 1963, did not feel like a day in history. It felt like a day of penance. The city of Nashville woke under a shroud of wet gray wool. The rain had paused, but the air remained thick with moisture, the kind of damp cold that settles into the marrow of the bones. It was a day designed for funerals. Jack Anglin sat in the barber's chair, the vinyl cool against his back. The air in the shop smelled of talcum powder, bay rum, and the stale smoke of morning cigarettes. It was a sanctuary of the mundane. Here, amidst the snipping of scissors and the hum of electric clippers, the world made sense. It was orderly. Hair grew. It was cut. Life continued. But on this morning, the conversation in the shop was not about baseball scores or local politics. It was hushed. It was about the plane. It was about Patsy. The barber, working carefully around Jack's ears, likely offered his condolences. In Nashville, you didn't need to know the stars personally to mourn them. They belonged to the city. Jack would have nodded, his face solemn in the mirror. He was a handsome man, his features defined by the hard living of the road, but softened by the success of recent years. He looked tired. The grief of the last 3 days had etched new lines around his eyes. He was 46 years old, but in the reflection, under the harsh fluorescent lights, he might have looked older. He was a survivor of the Great Depression, a veteran of the honky-tonk wars, and now a pallbearer for a generation. He checked his watch. The hands of the clock were moving with a malicious speed. The service for Patsy Cline was scheduled to begin shortly. It was not just a service, it was a command performance. The entire industry would be there. The cameras would be there. Jack Anglin needed to look the part of the elder statesman. He needed to be the rock that others could cling to. He paid the barber. He tipped well, he always did, and walked out into the gray morning. The door chimed as it closed behind him, a final cheerful sound that marked the end of his interaction with the normal world. He walked to his car. It was a large, heavy machine, American steel and chrome, built for the highways he had spent his life conquering. He slid behind the wheel, the leather creaking under his weight. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the chassis. Jack pulled out into traffic. He was heading toward the funeral home, but his mind was likely miles away. He was thinking about the route. He was thinking about the eulogy. He was thinking about Louise, waiting at home or perhaps already on her way to meet him. He turned onto New Due West Avenue. This road was not a highway. It was a local artery, a stretch of asphalt that wound through the rolling landscape of Madison, a suburb just north of Nashville. It was a road Jack knew, but it was a deceptive road. It had curves that tightened unexpectedly. It had ditches that waited hungrily at the shoulder. And on this morning the asphalt was slick with a treacherous film of oil and rainwater. Jack was running late. The pressure of the ticking clock began to squeeze him. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator. The car surged forward. We will never know exactly what happened in the cabin of that car in those final seconds. Was he adjusting the rearview mirror? Was he fumbling with the radio dial, trying to find a song that wasn't a dirge? Or was he simply lost in the fog of grief, his eyes seeing the road, but his mind seeing the wreckage of the Piper Comanche? He approached a curve. It was a sharp bend, unforgiving to those who disrespected its geometry. Jack Anglin, the man who had driven hundreds of thousands of miles across the North American continent, the man who had navigated blizzards in the Rockies and floods in the Delta, made a miscalculation. He entered the curve too fast. The tires lost their grip on the wet asphalt. The heavy rear end of the car swung out. The physics of the moment took over. The car was no longer a vehicle, it was a projectile. It left the road. There was no guardrail to catch him. There was only the muddy shoulder and a steep drainage ditch. The car plunged downward. It slammed into the earth with a violence that shattered the silence of the morning. It rolled. It struck a tree. The sound of the impact was a sickening crunch of metal and glass, a chaotic noise that lasted for a split second and was then instantly swallowed by the stillness of the woods. Jack Anglin died instantly. The medical reports would later speak of a fractured skull, of blunt force trauma, but those are clinical terms. The reality was that the rhythm man, the heartbeat of the Anglin Wright dynasty, was silenced before the echo of the crash had even faded. He died alone. There was no applause. There was no family. There was only the smell of wet earth, leaking gasoline, and the spinning of a wheel in the air. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the morning had already begun. The funeral service for Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins was a scene of surreal devastation. The venue was packed to capacity. The pews were filled with the royalty of country music. Webb Pierce was there. Bill Monroe was there. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and gardenias, a cloying perfume meant to mask the scent of death. The attendees were in a state of collective shock. They moved like sleepwalkers. They hugged each other with desperate intensity, clinging to the warmth of living bodies. They were there to bury three friends, but they felt like they were burying an era. The service began. Hymns were sung, eulogies were delivered, voices cracking with emotion. Tears flowed freely down the cheeks of men who had built their careers on stoicism. But as the service progressed, a ripple began to move through the back of the room. It started as a whisper among the ushers. It passed to the police officers standing at the doors. It jumped to the reporters hovering at the edges of the crowd. Jack Anglin. What about Jack? There's been an accident. Is he hurt? He's dead. The news traveled like a virus through the congregation. It moved from row to row, a contagion of fresh horror. Imagine the scene. You are sitting in a pew, weeping for Patsy Cline. You feel a tap on your shoulder. You turn. Someone whispers into your ear that Jack Anglin, the man you expected to see walking down the aisle as a pallbearer, the man you were planning to have a drink with after the service, is lying dead in a ditch on New Due West Avenue. The human mind has a limit to the amount of trauma it can process in a single hour. For the people in that room, the limit had been reached and breached. The funeral became a hallucination. The grief doubled back on itself, creating a feedback loop of a hysteria. Johnny Wright was there. He was standing with Kitty Wells. They were the pillars of the family, trying to hold it together for the sake of the others. Then someone approached Johnny. We can only imagine the specific brutality of that moment. The messenger likely hesitated. How do you tell a man who is burying his best friends that his partner, his brother-in-law, the other half of his professional soul, has just been killed? Johnny listened. He looked at the messenger. He likely didn't believe it at first. It was too absurd. It was too cruel. It sounded like a sick joke, a dark rumor born of the hysteria of the week. But the messenger insisted. It's confirmed, Johnny. The police are at the scene. It's Jack. Johnny Wright's knees likely buckled. The room spun. The sound of the preacher's voice faded into a dull roar. He looked at Kitty. He had to tell her. He had to tell the Queen that her sister's husband was gone. The news shattered them. They were trapped in a public ceremony, forced to maintain a semblance of dignity while their private world was being incinerated. They couldn't scream. They couldn't run. They had to stand there in their black suits and veils and absorb the blow. But the true epicenter of the tragedy was not at the funeral home. It was at a house on a quiet street in Madison. Louise Anglin was waiting. She was not at the barber shop. She was not at the funeral yet. She was at home, perhaps preparing to leave, perhaps waiting for Jack to return so they could go together. The house was quiet. The coffee cup Jack had left on the table was likely still there, a ghost of his morning routine. Louise was a woman of intuition. She had spent 25 years married to a man who lived on the edge. She knew the rhythm of his life. She knew when he was late. Jack was late. She checked the clock. The hands moved past the time he should have returned. A small knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach, but she pushed it down. Traffic, she told herself. He ran into an old friend. Then a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Jack's car. Louise went to the window. She saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. She saw men getting out. They were wearing uniforms. Every military wife, every policeman's wife, every touring musician's wife knows the fear of that sight. It is the universal symbol of the end. The two men walking up the path, the solemn faces, the hats removed and held against the chest. Louise opened the door before they knocked. She looked at their faces and she knew. She didn't need to hear the words. The silence of the house rushed out to meet the silence of the men. Mrs. Anglin? Yes, we are so sorry. The words that followed were a blur. New Due West Avenue, lost control, deceased. Louise Anglin did not faint. She did not scream. She stood in the doorway of the home that Jack had bought for her, the sanctuary they had built against the world, and she felt the foundation crack. The tragedy of the plane crash had been a public event. It belonged to the world. But this was hers. This was intimate. Jack hadn't died in a storm with legends. He had died on an errand, rushing to do his duty. He had died because he cared too much, because he was trying too hard to be there for everyone else. The officers likely asked if there was anyone they could call. Louise, through the fog of shock, had to think. Johnny? He was at the funeral? Kitty? At the funeral? Everyone she knew, everyone who could help her, was currently attending a service for the dead. She was completely, utterly alone. As the officers stood awkwardly in the hallway, unsure of what to do with this shattered woman, the reality of her new life began to settle upon Louise Anglin. The we was gone. There was only I. The rhythm section had stopped playing. Back at the funeral home, the service for Patsy Cline was ending. The crowd began to disperse, spilling out onto the wet streets. But the mood had shifted. The catharsis of the service had been replaced by a new, jagged edge of panic. The whispers were now shouts. "Did you hear about Jack? Did you hear?" Reporters scrambled. They had come to cover one tragedy and found themselves in the middle of a second. The story was changing in real time. The headlines for the evening papers were being rewritten in the minds of the editors. Tragedy strikes Opry again. Jack Anglin killed. The bodies of Patsy, Hawkshaw, and Copas were being prepared for transport to their final resting places. But now, a fourth body was being transported to the morgue. The undertakers of Nashville were overwhelmed. The city was running out of capacity for grief. Johnny Wright left the funeral home a broken man. He had walked in as half of a legendary duo. He walked out as a solo act. He had to go to Louise. He had to go to his sister and look her in the eye and explain why he was still breathing while her husband was not. The drive to Louise's house must have been the longest of his life. He drove past the same streets Jack had driven. He saw the same gray sky. But the world looked different now. The colors had been drained away. When he arrived, he found Louise. The reunion of the brother and sister in that house is a scene too private for history to record fully, but we can feel its weight. The embracing of two survivors in the wreckage of their dynasty. That night the sun went down on Nashville, but the darkness remained. The lights of the Grand Ole Opry were dimmed. The radio stations, already somber, seemed to hush even further. The black week of March 1963 was complete. Jack Anglin was dead. The man who had brought the Latin beat to the hills, the man who had championed the Queen, the man who had driven the Cadillac through the night, was gone. But for Louise, the tragedy wasn't that he was gone. The tragedy was that she was still here. She was left behind in a world that was celebrating the martyrdom of Patsy Cline, while her own martyr lay in a cold room, the victim of a simple, brutal twist of the wheel. The music had died twice in 1 week, and in the silence that followed, Louise Anglin closed the door, drew the curtains, and began the long, slow process of disappearing. The door to the Anglin house was closed, but the world outside was still screaming. If the morning of March 8th was defined by the shock of the crash, the days that followed were defined by a crushing, administrative numbness. Death, particularly sudden death, brings with it a mountain of logistics that grief does not pause to accommodate. For Louise Anglin, the woman standing in the sudden, deafening silence of her hallway, the time for weeping had to be stolen in moments between the ringing of the telephone and the signing of papers. The city of Nashville was suffering from a kind of funeral fatigue. The infrastructure of mourning was overwhelmed. The florists were running out of white lilies. The hearse drivers were working double shifts. The grave diggers at Woodlawn Memorial Park, the vast city of the dead on the outskirts of Nashville, were digging row after row. Louise had to plan a funeral. Consider the cruelty of this task. She had just watched her husband leave for a funeral. Now she was selecting the casket for the man who was supposed to be a pallbearer. She had to choose the hymns. She had to choose the clothes he would wear for eternity, likely the same dark suit he had put on that very morning, now ruined, replaced by another from the closet that still smelled of his cologne and tobacco. The service for Jack Anglin was held just days after the crash. It was a different affair from the hysterical, celebrity-studded event for Patsy Cline. It was quieter. It was heavier. The shock had worn off, replaced by a dull, aching reality. The attendees were the survivors of the Black Week. They were men and women who were sleepwalking through their grief. Johnny Wright stood by the grave, his face a mask of stone. Beside him stood Kitty Wells, the Queen in black, her stoicism finally cracking under the sheer weight of the loss. They weren't just burying a friend, they were burying a limb. Jack was the rhythm, the drive, the engine of their entire existence. Without him, they were unbalanced. The press was there, but less frantic. Jack's death was already settling into the narrative as the fourth tragedy, the aftershock to the earthquake. This positioning, Jack as the footnote, began even before the dirt hit the casket. Louise stood at the graveside, a small figure in a black veil, watching the world categorize her husband's death as a secondary plot point. As the earth was shoveled over Jack Anglin, closing the book on the physical man, a new and terrifying chapter began for the living. The concept of the show must go on is a romantic cliché in movies. In reality, it is a brutal economic imperative. The Johnny and Jack and Kitty Wells show was a business. It was a machine that employed musicians, drivers, roadies, and agents. It had contracts to fulfill. It had dates booked months in advance in theaters and fairgrounds across the country. The machine could not stop just because the engine had fallen out. In the weeks following the funeral, a grim meeting likely took place. Johnny Wright, now a solo act by default, had to make a decision. There was no Johnny and Jack without Jack. The harmony was broken. The Latin beat was silenced. Johnny looked at the calendar. The dates were there. The promoters were calling. Their condolences quickly followed by questions about ticket sales and refunds. Johnny Wright, a man of the Depression just like Jack, knew that if they stopped now, they might never start again. The momentum would die. The family would lose its income. So, he did the hardest thing a man can do. He got back on the bus. Imagine the first time the bus pulled away from Nashville without Jack. Imagine the empty seat. Imagine the silence in the card games where Jack's loud laugh and aggressive betting were missing. For Johnny, stepping onto the stage for the first time as a solo artist was a psychological amputation. For 25 years, he had looked to his left and seen Jack. He had leaned into the microphone and heard Jack's voice blending with his, creating that third perfect sound that neither could make alone. Now he looked to his left and saw nothing, just air. He had to sing the lead. He had to carry the rhythm. The band, the Tennessee Mountain Boys, played the notes, but the spiritual drive was gone. Johnny Wright eventually found his footing. He would go on to have a successful solo career, scoring a massive hit in 1965 with Hello Vietnam, a song that captured the zeitgeist of a new war. But those who knew him best said the shadow never truly left his eyes. He was a man performing with a phantom limb, always feeling the presence of the partner who wasn't there. While Johnny and Kitty returned to the road, throwing themselves into the grinding anesthesia of work, Louise Anglin remained in Nashville. And this is where the silence truly descended. Louise did not have a tour to distract her. She did not have a microphone to scream her grief into. She had a house, a large, quiet house filled with the artifacts of a life abruptly ended. She became a member of a club no one wants to join, the Widows of March. But unlike the other widows, her grief was complicated by the peculiar circumstances of Jack's death. Every time she turned on the radio or the television, she saw tributes to Patsy Cline. She saw specials, heard commemorative albums, read articles about the plane crash that killed the stars. The cultural narrative had solidified around the romantic tragedy of the plane. It was dramatic. It was clean. Jack's death, a car crash on the way to a funeral, was messy. It was ironic. It was uncomfortable. It didn't fit the myth. So the world largely ignored it. This phenomenon is known as disenfranchised grief. It is the grief that is not acknowledged by society. Louise had to mourn a man the world was busy forgetting. She had to walk through a grocery store where the magazines in the rack featured Patsy's face, but not Jack's. She had to listen to neighbors talk about the tragedy and know they weren't talking about her husband. This erasure is a form of psychological torture. It tells the survivor that their loss is less significant, that their pain is secondary. Louise responded by retreating. She pulled the perimeter of her life in tight. She stopped going to industry parties. She stopped appearing backstage at the Opry. The woman who had been a vital, if quiet, part of the social fabric of Music City began to fade. She didn't disappear all at once. It was a slow erosion. First, she declined invitations. Then, she stopped answering the phone. Then the curtains were drawn, and the house on the quiet street became a fortress of solitude. Inside that fortress, Louise Anglin was living in a museum of 1963. Jack's guitars were likely still there, in their cases. His suits hung in the closet. His awards were on the shelf. She became the curator of a legacy that no one was visiting. There is a profound loneliness in being the keeper of a memory that the world has moved past. The music industry is voracious. It eats its young and forgets its old. As the 1960s exploded into the psychedelic era, as the Vietnam War raged, as the civil rights movement transformed the South, the Latin beat of Johnny and Jack felt increasingly like a distant echo from another century. Louise watched the world change from her window. She saw the hair get longer, the music get louder. She saw Nashville transform into a corporate beast. And with every passing year, the distance between her and the day Jack drove away grew larger. Yet the pain remained as fresh as the rain on that Friday morning. Financial reality also began to set in. While Jack had been successful, the royalties of a songwriter and performer in the 1950s were not the vast fortunes of today. Without Jack's earning power on the road, Louise had to be careful. She lived a modest life, a stark contrast to the flashbulbs and Cadillacs of the glory days. But the cruelest aspect of her new life was the what if. Jack Anglin had been 46. He was not an old man. He was pivoting. He was mentoring. He was producing. Had he lived, it is entirely possible that Jack Anglin would have become one of the great architects of the 1960s and 70s Nashville sound. He had the ear for it. He had the respect. He might have discovered the next Dolly Parton or the next George Jones. Louise had to live with the ghost of that unwritten future. She had to live with the knowledge that a simple haircut, a few minutes of delay, a wet road, had stolen not just a husband, but a destiny. As the months turned into years, the name Jack Anglin began to fade from the lips of the public. He became a trivia question. Who was the fourth star who died that week? But in the Anglin house, he was still the center of the universe. Louise kept him alive in the only way she knew how, by remembering, by refusing to let go, by living in the silence he left behind, because in that silence, if she listened hard enough, she could still hear the faint driving rhythm of a guitar that once made the whole world dance. She was the guardian of the flame, even as the fire went out for everyone else. And as the 1960s came to a close, Louise Anglin had completed her transformation. She was no longer the wife of a star. She was the ghost of Music City, a woman walking through a life that had ended on a curve in the road, waiting for a reunion that felt an eternity away. The 1960s bled into the 1970s, and with the turning of the decade, the world that Jack Anglin had helped build began to dismantle itself. The black and white starkness of the post-war years, the era of sharp suits and acoustic guitars, was replaced by the polyester haze of a new Nashville. This was no longer the town where a handshake deal on Music Row meant something. It was becoming a corporate beast, a machine of slick production and crossover ambition that had little use for the ghosts of the past. For Louise Anglin, this transition was not merely a cultural shift. It was a slow, agonizing erasure. She was living in a time capsule. While the rest of the city was rushing forward, paving over the old landmarks to build souvenir shops and office towers, Louise remained anchored in March 1963. Her life had become a static point in a rapidly expanding universe. The most symbolic death knell for Jack's era came in 1974. It was the year the Grand Ole Opry decided to leave the Riemann Auditorium. The Ryman, that dusty, humid, sacred tabernacle of country music, where Jack had stood in the spotlight, where the floorboards vibrated with the stomping feet of the Anglin clan, was deemed obsolete. The Opry moved to a new air-conditioned theme park in the suburbs called Opryland. It was clean, it was modern, it was soulless. Johnny Wright and Kitty Wells, survivors of the old guard, made the move. They adapted. They walked onto the new, expansive stage at Opryland, smiling for the television cameras, singing the old hits for a new generation of tourists who arrived on air-conditioned buses. They were professionals. They did what they had to do to survive. But one has to wonder if Louise Anglin ever set foot in that new complex. To go there would have been to admit that the Ryman was dead, and by extension that the world Jack lived in was truly gone. The new Opryland had no ghosts, it had no corners where Jack's laughter still echoed. It was a sanitized version of history, and in sanitized history, there is no room for the messy, tragic reality of a man dying in a ditch on the way to a funeral. As the 1970s progressed, a cruel dynamic solidified within the extended family. Kitty Wells was still the queen of country music, a living legend. Johnny Wright was the respected elder statesman. They were celebrated. They were interviewed. They were the visible survivors. Louise was the invisible one. She existed in the margins of their fame. At family gatherings, Thanksgiving dinners, and Christmas parties, she was there, the quiet aunt, the widow. But her presence was a constant, silent reminder of the missing chair at the head of the table. One can imagine the tension, unspoken but palpable. Johnny, looking at his sister, must have felt the pang of survivor's guilt every time their eyes met. Why was he still singing? Why was he still breathing? Why was Jack, the engine of their dreams, rotting in the ground while Johnny signed autographs? Louise never accused. She never raged. She simply endured. But endurance is its own form of suffering. It is a low-level hum of pain that never ceases. She watched her sister-in-law, Kitty, age gracefully. She watched her brother, Johnny, grow gray. She saw them become grandparents, saw them celebrate golden anniversaries. She was denied all of this. Jack remained forever 46, a frozen image in a silver frame on the mantelpiece, while Louise was forced to walk the long, lonely road of aging, alone. And then came the cultural insult that twisted the knife deeper. In the 1980s, Hollywood discovered the tragedy of March 1963, but Hollywood, as it always does, required a clean narrative. It required a star. In 1985, the film Sweet Dreams was released. It was a biopic of Patsy Cline starring Jessica Lange. The movie was a sensation. It revived interest in Patsy's music, introducing her to a generation born long after the crash. Crazy became a hit all over again. Patsy Cline was canonized not just as a singer, but as a feminist icon, a tragic heroine, a goddess of heartache. Louise Anglin lived to see this. She lived to see the world fall in love with a woman whose funeral her husband died trying to attend. One can only speculate on the profound bitterness of watching that film or even seeing the commercials for it. The narrative of the movie focused on Patsy's turbulent marriage, her rise to fame, and the plane crash. The crash was depicted as the singular defining tragedy of the era. Jack Anglin? He was nowhere to be found in the cultural conversation. He wasn't a character in the movie. He wasn't a footnote in the reviews. The revival of Patsy Cline inadvertently solidified the oblivion of Jack Anglin. He became collateral damage in the myth-making process. The spotlight was so bright on Patsy that it cast a shadow deep enough to swallow Jack whole. This is the brutality of historical memory. It is selective. It is unfair. It picks a protagonist and discards the supporting cast. For Louise, this wasn't just an annoyance. It was a negation of her life's meaning. It felt as though the world was saying that Jack's life mattered less, that his death was merely an inconvenient detail in the grand opera of Patsy Cline. Louise sat in her house in Madison, surrounded by the silence, while the world sang sweet dreams. She had no movie deal. She had no royalties from a sudden revival. She had only the fading royalties of songs recorded 30 years prior, checks that grew smaller with every passing quarter as the radio stations shifted to pop country and forgot the Latin beat of Johnny and Jack. The financial reality of Louise's later years is a subject often overlooked in the biographies of the stars, but it is the daily reality of the widow. Jack Anglin did not die a multimillionaire. He died comfortable, yes, but the wealth of the 1950s country stars was not the wealth of today's stadium fillers. There were no streaming rights. There were no massive endorsement deals. Louise had to be careful. She lived a life of quiet modesty. The Cadillacs were gone, replaced by sensible sedans. The vacations were few. She became a woman of small routines: the grocery store, the church, the cemetery, Woodlawn Memorial Park. This was Louise's true social circle in the long twilight of her life. She visited Jack's grave with the devotion of a nun. She tended the stone. She brought flowers. But even there, in the city of the dead, she could not escape the hierarchy of fame. Patsy Cline is buried at Shenandoah Memorial Park in Virginia, but a massive memorial stands at the crash site in Camden, Tennessee. Tourists flock there. They leave pennies, notes, and flowers. Jack's grave at Woodlawn is dignified, but it is not a shrine. It is a grave. Louise would stand there, perhaps watching a tour bus drive by on its way to see the homes of the living stars, and feel the crushing weight of anonymity. She was guarding a treasure that the world had decided was just a rock. As the years ground on, the physical toll of grief began to manifest. The human body keeps the score. Decades of repressed sorrow, of silent endurance, settle into the joints and the heart. Louise's health began to decline. She became frail. The spark that had once helped Jack Anglin build a dynasty was dimming. Her world shrank to the size of a room. The telephone rang less and less. The old friends were dying off. Cowboy Copas's widow, Hawkshaw Hawkins' widow. They were all fading away one by one, the sorority of 1963 disbanding into the earth. Johnny Wright and Kitty Wells remained the stalwarts. They continued to perform well into their 70s and 80s. In 1991, they played a farewell concert. It was a celebration of a lifetime in music. They were lauded as icons. Did they think of Jack that night? Of course they did. He was in the DNA of every song they sang. But for the audience, Jack Anglin was just a name in a history book, a trivia answer. Who was Johnny's partner? Louise Anglin watched her brother and sister-in-law take their final bows from a distance. She was the keeper of the original flame, the one who remembered when they were all just hungry kids in a beat-up car, dreaming of a hot meal. She held the memory of the struggle, which is often more intimate than the memory of the victory. The 1990s and 2000s were a long, slow fade. Louise was now an old woman. The Nashville outside her window was unrecognizable. It was a city of bachelorette parties and pop stars in cowboy hats. The Latin beat of Poison Love would sound like alien transmission to the kids on Broadway. But inside Louise's mind, the rhythm never stopped. She held on to Jack not as the star, but as the man, the man who needed a haircut, the man who loved his coffee black, the man who had looked at her with desperation and love in the hard years. She died without a press release on October 29, 2011. She was 92 years old. There was no breaking news alert on the television. There was no disruption to the broadcast of the Country Music Awards. Louise Anglin passed away quietly, stepping out of the long shadow she had inhabited for nearly half a century. Her death was the final closing of the door on March 8, 1963. As long as she was alive, there was a living witness to the specific sharp pain of that day. There was someone who felt the loss of Jack Anglin not as history, but as a missing limb. When she died, Jack Anglin finally became fully historical. He ceased to be a husband and became purely a legacy. They buried her next to him. Finally, the silence of the house in Madison was complete. The artifacts of their life, the photos, the suits, the guitars, were distributed or packed away. The physical evidence of their existence began to scatter. But there is a strange physics to love and grief. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. The sheer force of will that Louise Anglin exerted to keep Jack's memory alive, even just within the fortress of her own heart, had a weight to it. It is a weight that presses down on the history of Nashville, even if the city doesn't feel it. The tragedy of Louise Anglin was not just that she lost her husband. It was that she lost her place in the story. She was the protagonist of a tragedy that everyone decided to treat as a subplot. She lived a life of epic endurance, a solitary marathon of grief, without a cheering section. She was the woman who stayed. When we look back at the history of country music, we see the bright stars. We see the tragics like Hank Williams and Patsy Cline. We see the survivors like Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton. We do not see the Louise Anglins. We do not see the women who sit in the quiet houses after the funeral cars have driven away, paying the bills with shrinking royalty checks, growing old alone, holding the hand of a ghost. But they are the mortar between the bricks of the Hall of Fame. And in that long, slow death, Louise Anglin proved that she was the strongest of them all. She carried the burden of the memory when the rest of the world had put it down. She was the keeper of the watch. And only when her heart stopped beating was the watch finally, truly wound down. The music had faded. The lights were off. The bus was parked. But the story, the true, unvarnished, heartbreaking story of the Anglins, remains, waiting for someone to blow the dust off the record and listen to the B-side where the real sorrow lies.